1375. The English mercenary captain and exiled lord Sir John Hawkwood sits in his tent, reading yet another letter from his employer, sighing in frustration. How much profit and rejoicing is received by the Roman Church from the indefatigable labors of you and your warriors. You are truly a warrior of Christ, athlete of God, and faithful Christian knight. But you can't pay angry mercenaries with fancy schmancy words, and Hawkwood didn't care about any of this praise. Hawkwood wanted one thing: money. He made a decision. At this point, he decided to go solo, ditching the Pope and considering their contract finished due to lack of payment. Sitting up, he saw the rich Duchy of Tuscany in the distance. Hawkwood gathered his troops and moved his now unemployed mercenary force towards the richest city in Tuscany, Florence. He marched at the head of a vast army, full of veteran troops and siege weapons, the largest army currently in Italy. Florence, as well as the rest of the city-states in the Tuscan League, saw no point in armed resistance versus such a well-equipped and prestigious foe, and instead sent negotiators to treat with Hawkwood. Hawkwood, being incredibly confident, demanded an absurd price for his withdrawal. But upon returning to Florence, the council actually agreed. The end price for Hawkwood to screw off was 130,000 florins, which could be estimated to be $120 million today. For reference, this was almost twice what the prosperous Medici Bank, one of the richest banks at the time, had on hand. Hawkwood, emboldened by this windfall, went on ravaging the lands of Tuscany, drawing out agreements for large sums of money from each state and burninating the countryside as he went, of course. Overall, he managed to extort 220,000 florins out of the Tuscans, and they blamed the Pope for this. If you remember, the Pope recently made a truce with the Milanese, right as he was asking the Florentines for money. Meanwhile, it seemed like the Pope ended Hawkwood's contract right next to their borders, practically inviting him to raid them. This stirred incredibly anti-papal sentiment in Florence. As they saw the Pope was to blame for them paying the exorbitant ransom to Hawkwood, Florence figured, why not make the church pay for most of it? This was really unheard of back in the time, but the city was really enraged enough to get behind taking church property and forcing enormous loans upon the clergy. Them doing this prompted the Pope to, wow, big surprise, excommunicate them. But the city didn't care. In response, they elected the
Otto Santi della Guerra,
the 8 Saints of War. Fantastic band name, by the way. Or maybe an 8-cleric D&D group? Desperate times called for desperate measures, and the alliances of the area shifted again as Florence quickly sent emissaries to make a defensive league against the Pope with their rivals, the Milanese, headed by none other than Bernabo and Galeazzo Visconti. Now, if you remember, Bernabo literally just made peace with the Pope, but seeing as the Tuscan League was gearing up for war, who was he to resist? He had his eyes on taking back Bologna from the Pope, and this could just be his shot. This sudden reversal was not what the Pope was going for, and almost immediately, the conflict mutated into Italians against the French, the defense of the homeland against a foreign Pope, and the restoration of republican rights. In 10 days, 80 cities and towns joined the Anti-papal alliance. Cities within the Papal States, emboldened by Florence's Anti-papal League, started revolting. Banners reminiscent of Rome, emblazoned with the word libertas, were distributed, and the seeds of Italian nationalism were forming within the country, harkening back to the Roman Republic. Because of this, Gregory did what most popes do in the face of defiance. He excommunicated the entire Duchy of Tuscany. He forbade church service from being performed, and amazingly for medieval times, the Tuscans, namely the Florentines, were completely on board with it, at least for a while. While the anti-papal alliance grew, they didn't really possess a centralized army. Italian warfare was, at the time, dominated by mercenaries, and Hawkwood, leader of the English White Company, was the most sought-after mercenary in Italy. One of the reasons for the White Company's successes was the use of tactics from the Hundred Years' War in France, where the company was formed. These tactics included making use of combined arms warfare, using dismounted knights wielding pikes with longbowmen in the back, which proved incredibly effective. Despite him already raiding Florence, the Florentines desperately wanted to recruit him to their side. Tales of how great he and his army were probably exaggerated, because if everyone kept hiring, he must be good, right? However, the Pope also wanted to bring Hawkwood back into the fold, and it basically became a bidding war between the two factions. But Hawkwood eventually went back to Big Daddy Pope when he used those deep papal coffers to promise the huge sum of 30,000 florins a month. Cities were revolting within the Papal States, including Rome itself, shrugging off their mostly French rulership. The war devolved into essentially a game of whack-a-mole. Rebels would rise up in a papal city-state, and the Pope would send mercenaries to put them down. But the Pope, once again, wasn't paying his mercenaries. The papacy was broke, because its rich city-states and the Papal States were all revolting. Therefore, mercenaries, Hawkwood most notably, would typically demand ownership of the towns that they recaptured, after looting the place of course, to be granted to them personally in recompense of not being paid. Many were carving up their own private realms from back pay, and Hawkwood himself had several fortresses, towns, and abbeys granted to him from the Pope. However, the Pope's chief legate in Italy, a Frenchman known as Robert of Geneva, remember this guy, he's important, wanted to accelerate getting his lands back. Described as a squat and vengeful guy, he was furious that his rich provinces were revolting against him. He hired some Breton mercenaries, which were busy happily robbing and looting near Avignon because they were unemployed due to a lull in the 100 Years' War between England and France. He figured he could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, get them away from the papal court, and have them fight the rebels for him. Fantastic idea, nothing could go wrong. Before having them cross the Alps, he blessed and consecrated their swords, which, to nobody's surprise, they promptly used to rape and burn their way across Italy. Meanwhile, Bologna, the keystone of Lombardy, was once again taken by Bernabo Visconti, for like the 3rd time, and Robert really wanted to get it back. However, much like me and shooters, Robert's ragtag Bretons were clearly better at looting than fighting. They failed to take back the city after losing several battles against the Anti-papal League's forces, and in failure, Robert took his Breton mercenaries southwest into Cesena for the winter. Having been thwarted, Robert of Geneva stewed outside the city walls of Cesena with his mercenaries. There was very little food outside of the city, and he made the decision to let the Bretons inside the walls. Unsurprisingly, this army of brigands didn't behave itself, and stole and looted from the locals. The Cesenians naturally weren't so into this, and started a riot, hunting down and killing around 300 of the foreigners in retaliation. Robert, being a representative of the Pope, viewed this as an affront to both God and his authority, and to keep himself in their good graces, urged the Bretons to extract their revenge from the city. Men, women, and children were slaughtered in this terrible event, many trying to escape the wrath of the mercenaries. The affair would end up with 8,000 citizens dead and the city in ruins. Robert looked on and cried out to the citizens to submit, because this was for the good of the army. Meanwhile, the rest of Italy looked upon this act in horror, and Robert earned himself the moniker, the Butcher of Cesena. Hawkwood too, being at the time nearby in Faenza, where he owned a castle, given to him in lieu of wages owed by the Pope, was unable to resist a good bit of looting. He also made the decision to take a minor part in the horrible massacre. Being sickened by his own actions, he promptly responded to an offer from Florence and Bernabo Visconti of Milan to join the Anti-papal League, changing sides yet again, which included both an increase in pay and a marriage offer to one of Bernabo's 37 kids. Hawkwood was therefore charged with pursuing and fighting the Breton mercenaries employed by the Pope. But living that mercenary life, he didn't actually end up ever fighting them. Instead, he ended up following them all the way to Siena in the south, looting the countryside along the way, as you do, until finally, a Sienese force dispersed them and defeated them. And Hawkwood's band never actually had to fight. Florence at this point was completely fed up with Hawkwood's mercenaries, but saw itself having no choice but to continue paying them. They would shit-talk Hawkwood behind his back to their allies, but address him with the utmost respect to keep him contained. Towns being granted to foreigners, the slaughter at Cesena, foreign mercenaries burning and looting the countryside. All of this kind of formed a glue between the mostly fragmented and culturally separated Italian states. Adversity does breed unity after all. Whilst all this was happening though, Gregory was still hemming and hawing over whether he should just chill in Avignon for a few more years or actually head back to Rome. The King of France and Cardinals really didn't want him to go back, but with the war not going so well, he finally decided to take the plunge and moved the Holy See back to Rome, something that hasn't been done in nearly a century. As he arrived, the city of Rome greeted him with a gusto. However, due to the prompting from both Bernabo Visconti and even surprisingly his new son-in-law, John Hawkwood, negotiations for peace were started. The defeat of the Bretons was a serious blow to the Pope's war effort, which underscored the futility of the conflict as a whole. After 3 long years, the War of the Eight Saints had produced little apart from campaigns directed against innocent civilians. Both the Pope and the League were financially exhausted from throwing so much money at mercenaries and troops, and peace negotiations gathered momentum. However, very shortly after entering Rome and starting peace talks, Pope Gregory XI promptly died there. Wow, terrible timing. This led the war ending pretty awkwardly. The Florentines ended up paying the papacy 200,000 florins, which was ironically more than they originally paid Hawkwood to screw off from Florentine lands to begin with. Despite the war ending so abruptly, the scars it left were there to stay. Distrust over a foreign papacy, and a unifying under Italian strife were the fruits of this conflict. All of this directly led to the monumental events that followed. The cardinals present in Rome that met to elect a new pope were a scattered bunch, due to many of them choosing to stay in Avignon rather than follow the pope to Rome. Though most were French, they were split evenly between two rival factions who couldn't agree on a pope to elect. While they argued, a mob of Roman citizens gathered outside of the papal enclave. They wanted a Roman to be elected pope, and not a Frenchman. The mob set up gallows outside and stormed the conclave, keeping the cardinals at gunpoint, sword point. Terrified for their lives, the cardinals decided that, God was indeed telling them to elect a Roman. Wow! They elected the Archbishop of Bari, a Roman, as Pope Urban VI, which satisfied the mob. The cardinals at first accepted the pope, thinking, how bad could it be? But quickly, Urban's power went to his head. In the eyes of the church, he was a loose cannon. He got in fights with the rest of the cardinals, publicly chastised them for selling dioceses, their luxurious lifestyles, and ordered the papal treasury to not pay them their customary half of revenues from benefices, but to instead use it for the restoration of churches in Rome. Even worse, he ordered these princes of the church to restrict their meals to just one course. The last straw was the new pope refusing to return to Avignon with them. They didn't want to stay in Rome. They almost got killed, and all of their stuff was in Avignon. That was it. The cardinals fled back to Avignon. There was no procedure to oust an existing pope, and they simply couldn't tolerate this one. I mean, one-course meals? What the hell? So they called another conclave and elected another pope in Avignon. They elected none other than Robert of Geneva, the Butcher of Cesena, as Pope Clement VII, anti-pope to Urban VI in Rome. This was the start of the Western Schism. Join me next time as we continue our delve into the Western Schism, all of the ridiculousness it brought, and how it threatened to topple the Christian world of the 14th century. Thank you for watching. Now this is the story all about how the Pope sent Hawkwood into my town, and I'd like to take a minute to just be a tizzle. I'll tell you how it started the big ol' Western fascism.